Explanation begins as a form of orientation. It allows inner experience to take shape in language. It offers continuity between intention and perception. It reassures both speaker and listener that meaning is shared. At first, this feels stabilizing. Words appear to carry weight. Clarification seems to restore balance. Misunderstanding feels temporary, correctable. But this phase does not last indefinitely. Over time, explanation changes function. It no longer follows certainty. It attempts to create it. The individual may not notice when this shift occurs. There is no moment of collapse, no clear boundary. Life continues. Communication continues. Speech becomes more frequent, not less. What changes is a psychological position behind the words. Instead of expressing a settled inner state, explanation begins to compensate for the absence of one. This difference is subtle, and because it is subtle, it is often misunderstood. The individual may feel they're being responsible, thoughtful, transparent. They explain intentions before being questioned. They clarify tone before conflict appears. They justify decisions that were already made internally. Nothing feels excessive. Nothing feels forced. Yet something has begun to thin. Words no longer land with the same authority. Statements invite follow-up rather than closure. Meaning disperses instead of consolidating. This is rarely recognized as a psychological shift. It is usually interpreted as a communication issue. The individual may conclude they need to be clearer, more precise, more articulate, so they add more words, and the effect intensifies. Explanation expands, but presence contracts. This contraction does not feel dramatic. It feels functional, almost invisible. But others sense it, not consciously, not analytically. They sense that something behind the words is unsettled. This is why explanation begins to lose power, not because it is inaccurate, not because it is dishonest, but because it no longer originates from a stable internal position. Words derive authority from containment. When containment weakens, language compensates, and compensation is perceptible. In everyday life, this appears in small moments. A person explains a decision and immediately feels a need to add context, then reassurance, then clarification. The listener may not interrupt. They may nod. They may agree. Yet the explanation continues, not because it is required, but because the speaker has not felt the internal stop signal. That stop signal comes from inner finality. When it disappears, speech loses its boundary. This is exhausting, though not always consciously so. The individual may notice that conversations feel longer, more draining, less satisfying. They speak more but feel less heard. This often leads to confusion. They may wonder why others seem resistant, why their intentions are misunderstood, why clarity does not resolve tension. The common assumption is that misunderstanding is the problem. It is not. The problem is dispersion. Each explanation disperses energy outward. Attention moves toward reception, toward reaction, toward anticipation. The internal center shifts. Instead of standing inside a position and speaking from it, the individual begins to orbit around it. Orbiting creates motion, but it does not create gravity. Gravity requires density. Density forms when energy is held. Explanation, when overused, prevents holding. This is why silence begins to feel uncomfortable during this phase. Silence removes the ability to regulate perception. Without words, the individual cannot shape how they are seen. This exposure can feel risky. Silence may be interpreted as indifference, as guilt, as incompetence, or so the individual imagines. So speech fills a gap, not to communicate, but to manage. At this point, explanation is no longer relational. It is regulatory. It regulates anxiety, uncertainty, anticipated judgment. The words are directed outward, but their function is inward. This is why they fail. They were not meant to land. They were meant to soothe. Others feel this mismatch even if they cannot name it. They may sense that something is being defended, that something is not settled. They may respond with questions, with distance, with diminished regard, not as punishment, as perception. Human interaction is sensitive to psychological density. People respond to where energy is located. When energy is scattered across justifications, presence weakens. This does not mean the individual lacks confidence. Often, they are highly reflective, self-aware, conscientious. These qualities can intensify the pattern. The more perspectives a person can imagine, the more explanations they generate. They anticipate misunderstanding before it occurs. They address objections before they are voiced. They speak from awareness, but not from containment. Containment requires exclusion. Not every interpretation needs to be addressed. Not every reaction needs management. When everything is included, nothing is weighted. This is when explanation loses authority. Authority does not come from correctness. It comes from consolidation. A single sentence spoken from a consolidated position carries more weight than paragraphs spoken from dispersion. The psyche recognizes this instinctively. At some point, it begins to withdraw support from speech. This withdrawal does not feel intentional. It is experienced as fatigue. The individual may notice that explaining feels heavier, that words feel less available, less convincing. They may still speak, but something has shifted. Silence begins to appear spontaneously, not as a strategy, as a limit. The person may pause longer before responding. They may choose not to elaborate. They may stop justifying. This can feel unsettling. Without explanation, identity feels exposed. The familiar scaffolding disappears. The individual can no longer rely on words to stabilize interaction. This is often misread as withdrawal, as detachment, as loss of interest. But something else is occurring. Energy is returning inward. The psyche is reclaiming what was dispersed. Earlier, energy flowed outward into explanation, into defense, into interpretation management. Now that flow reverses. Reversal creates pressure. Without speech as an outlet, the internal state becomes denser. The individual may feel heavier, quieter, more contained. This containment is not emptiness. It is fullness without expression. This is why silence begins to feel charged, not peaceful, not relaxed, charged. The individual may feel watched, exposed, unprotected, not because others are doing anything differently, but because the usual buffer is gone. The buffer was explanation. Without it, presence stands alone. This is the point where many people return to speech. They feel the discomfort and re-engage old patterns. They explain again, clarify again, reassure again. The relief is immediate and temporary. The underlying shift continues because the psyche has already identified that explanation no longer serves its function. Words cannot restore what has been withdrawn. The individual may not know why silence feels necessary. They may resist it, but the resistance does not resolve the discomfort. This creates a paradox. Speaking feels ineffective. Silence feels risky. Neither option restores equilibrium. This is often the moment when the experience is misinterpreted. The individual may label themselves as disengaged, unmotivated, socially fatigued. None of these descriptions are precise. What has changed is the relationship between language and authority. Earlier, language carried authority. Now, authority is relocating. Authority is moving away from expression. This movement is quiet and irreversible. The psyche does not reverse reorganizations once initiated. Explanation has exhausted its role. It did what it needed to do. It maintained coherence during a certain phase of development. But that phase is ended. The psyche does not announce this ending. It simply removes energy. Speech remains possible, but it no longer feels supported. This is why silence begins to appear without intention. The individual may notice that they stop explaining even when they could, even when it might be helpful, not as rebellion, not as withdrawal, as neutrality. Nothing inside pushes them to speak. This neutrality is unfamiliar. Earlier, speech was automatic. Now it requires justification. This reversal is significant. When speech requires justification, silence becomes a default. The individual may not trust this yet. They may feel they are failing to engage properly. But the psyche is not withdrawing engagement. It is withdrawing dispersion. Presence is becoming more concentrated. Concentration alters how others respond. Not immediately, not dramatically, but subtly. Without explanation, interactions slow. People adjust. They pay closer attention. Not because silence is powerful, but because density is perceptible. Words once filled space. Now, space remains. Space invites projection from others. They fill the gap. They interpret. They respond differently. This can feel uncomfortable. Without explanation, the individual cannot control interpretation. They must tolerate ambiguity. This tolerance is difficult. It removes the illusion of control, but it also reveals something important. Control was never achieved through explanation. It was only delayed. The psyche recognizes this, and so it allows explanation to fall away, not as an instruction, as a consequence. This is not a conclusion. Nothing is resolved yet, but something has become clear. Explanation did not lose power because it was wrong. It lost power because it was no longer rooted in a center that required reinforcement. The words fell away because something inside no longer needed them. That recognition settles quietly, without relief, without clarity, just a shift in weight. Silence has begun to replace explanation, not as an ideal, as a necessity. When explanation loses its function, silence does not immediately replace it as a choice. Silence appears first as a byproduct of energy no longer being released outward. The individual may notice they speak less without deciding to. Responses shorten. Pauses lengthen. Words no longer arrive automatically. This is not restraint. It is redistribution. Carl Jung described psychological energy as something that follows interest and identification. Where attention goes, energy flows. When explanation dominated, energy flowed outward toward interpretation management. When explanation withdraws, that flow reverses. Silence is the surface expression of this reversal. What is happening internally is consolidation. Energy that was previously scattered across anticipation, defense, and justification begins to gather. This gathering produces density. Density alters presence before it alters behavior. This is why silence begins to have an effect before it is understood. In everyday settings, this shift can be observed clearly. In organizational psychology, repeated studies on leadership perception show a consistent pattern. Individuals who speak less, but speak from settled positions, are rated as more authoritative than those who speak frequently and explain extensively. Importantly, this perception change occurs without any measurable difference in competence, expertise, or output. Only verbal density changes. The mechanism is not mystery. It is consolidation. When someone does not rush to fill space, others adjust their attention. Silence interrupts habitual interaction patterns. It slows the environment down. And slowing reveals structure. Carl Jung emphasized that the psyche reveals its order only when compulsive movement stops. Silence performs this function externally. It creates a pause where unconscious assumptions surface. People begin to project. They attribute intention. They infer meaning. They respond more carefully. Not because silence is intimidating, but because silence does not dissipate energy. In daily life, this is often first noticed in familiar relationships. A person who previously explained themselves frequently may stop doing so. Not abruptly, not demonstratively, simply by omission. They answer what is asked. They stop anticipating. They do not add context unless it is necessary. The response from others shifts. Questions increase at first. Clarifications are requested. Then something settles. The environment recalibrates. This recalibration is well documented in communication research. Studies on conversational dominance show that individuals who tolerate pauses are consistently perceived as more confident and more internally anchored, even when their verbal contribution is minimal. The effect intensifies in situations involving disagreement or evaluation. Silence here is not passive. It is contained. Containment changes how psychological power operates. Earlier, power attempted to manage outcomes. Now it stabilizes presence. Carl Jung distinguished between ego power and psychic authority. Ego power relies on assertion and reinforcement. Psychic authority emerges when inner alignment is complete enough that reinforcement is unnecessary. Silence signals this completion without announcing it. This is why silence feels different depending on its origin. Silence born of fear feels hollow. Silence born of consolidation feels dense. Others sense the difference. They may not articulate it, but they respond accordingly. In workplace settings, this often manifests as reduced pushback, not compliance, but adjustment. Colleagues may stop challenging every statement. Meetings become shorter. Decisions face less resistance. Again, nothing else has changed. The individual did not adopt a strategy. They did not learn a technique. They did not assert dominance. They stopped leaking energy. This leak had been occurring through overclarification. Psychological studies on impression management consistently show that excessive explanation is interpreted unconsciously as uncertainty. Even when explanations are logical, the surplus of justification creates the impression that the position is negotiable. Silence removes negotiability, not by force, by closure. Closure does not mean rigidity. It means completion. When something is internally complete, it does not invite elaboration. Carl Jung wrote that when psychic energy returns to its center, the personality becomes less reactive and more gravitational. Gravity does not chase. It draws. Silence is gravitational, but only when it emerges from consolidation. This is why forced silence fails. When someone attempts to be quiet as a tactic, the effect reverses. The silence feels strained. Others sense withholding rather than containment. The energy still leaks, just without words. Consolidation cannot be performed. It occurs when the psyche finishes withdrawing energy from external regulation. This withdrawal is often supported by lived experience. Many individuals notice this shift after repeated failures of explanation, after realizing that clarity does not protect them, that justification does not resolve tension, that words do not secure recognition. At some point, the psyche stops investing, not consciously, structurally. This is consistent with Jung's observation that the unconscious intervenes when conscious strategies exhaust their usefulness. Silence becomes a default because explanation no longer receives energy. This has measurable effects on daily life. In interpersonal dynamics, reduced verbal explanation often leads to clearer boundaries without explicit boundary setting. Studies in relationship psychology show that individuals who stop over-explaining experience fewer repeated boundary violations, not because they enforce more strictly, but because ambiguity decreases. Ambiguity decreases when inner positions solidify. Earlier, explanation attempted to reduce ambiguity externally. Now, consolidation reduces it internally. Internal clarity projects outward without language. This projection is not symbolic. It is behavioral. Posture changes. Timing changes. Response patterns change. These micro-adjustments are widely documented in social psychology. They influence how others read confidence, decisiveness, and reliability. The individual may not be aware of these changes. They may only notice that interactions feel different, quieter, shorter, more neutral. This neutrality is important. Neutrality is often mistaken for detachment, but neutrality here is the absence of emotional leakage. Earlier, explanations carried emotional residue, concern, defensiveness, anticipation. Silence carries none of this. It presents the situation without commentary. Carl Jung noted that when the ego stops identifying with outcomes, the personality gains a quiet firmness. This firmness does not push. It does not persuade. It stabilizes. This stabilization changes power dynamics subtly but decisively. People orient themselves differently around someone who is stable. They test less. They provoke less. They project less. Not because they are controlled, because there is nothing to hook into. In leadership research, this phenomenon is described as low reactivity authority. Leaders who exhibit minimal emotional reactivity and restrained verbal output are consistently rated as more trustworthy and more capable of handling complexity. The critical factor is not silence itself. It is containment. Silence is simply the visible edge of that containment. In daily life, this may appear as fewer explanations to family members, less justification to friends, less rehearsal of decisions allowed. The individual may notice they do not need to convince. Convincing requires doubt. Containment does not. This is where Carl Jung's concept of individuation becomes relevant. Individuation involves a withdrawal of projections and consolidation of psychic energy into the self rather than the ego. When this process advances, external validation loses its regulatory role. Silence naturally increases, not as withdrawal from life, as reorientation toward internal authority. This internal authority is not authoritarian. It does not demand agreement. It does not require acknowledgement. It exists regardless of response. This is why silence begins to feel sufficient, not superior. Sufficient, the need to add disappears. The individual may still speak. They may still explain when necessary. But the compulsion is gone. Compulsion was the leak. Without it, energy remains intact. This intactness is felt by others. In group settings, research on conversational turn-taking shows that individuals who speak less frequently, but with clear endpoints, are interrupted less. The group unconsciously respects completion. Completion is not signaled by volume or length. It is signaled by internal finality. Silence carries that signal. Carl Jung argued that psychological power does not come from assertion, but from alignment between conscious stance and unconscious support. When this alignment exists, the psyche no longer needs to defend itself. Silence becomes safe, not because nothing can happen, but because nothing needs to be managed prematurely. This changes how time is experienced. Conversations slow. Decisions unfold without urgency. Responses wait. Waiting is no longer threatening. Earlier, waiting created anxiety because outcomes felt unstable. Now, waiting feels neutral. This neutrality is the result of consolidation. The psyche has reclaimed its energy. It is no longer dispersed across possible interpretations. It rests, and resting energy has weight. That weight is what people respond to, not the absence of words, the presence behind them. This realization settles gradually, not as insight, as experience. Silence is no longer something to overcome. It is simply what remains when psychological power stops leaking outward. And that is enough. When silence has completed its work internally, it no longer feels like a state that needs to be maintained. It simply becomes how presence operates. The most noticeable change is not dramatic. There's no surge of confidence, no emotional lift, no sense of arrival. What changes is friction. Earlier, daily life contained constant internal negotiation. What to say, how to say it, when to clarify, when to explain further. Now, much of that negotiation disappears. Not because everything is resolved, but because fewer things require management. Carl Jung described this phase as a return of psychic energy to its proper center. When energy is no longer dispersed into reaction and self-monitoring, it becomes available for simple engagement with reality. Life becomes more direct. This directness shows up in ordinary situations. At work, decisions are made without rehearsal. You state what is relevant. You stop when it is said. Meetings feel shorter, not because efficiency is forced, but because unnecessary elaboration no longer occurs. Organizational studies consistently show that individuals who communicate with minimal justification are perceived as more decisive, even when their decisions are identical to those who over-explain. The difference is not content. It is containment. Containment signals completion. In daily interactions, this often results in fewer follow-up questions, not because others fully understand, but because they sense that understanding does not require negotiation. This is a subtle but measurable shift. Research in social psychology has repeatedly found that people are less likely to challenge statements that are delivered without hedging or emotional leakage. Silence around a statement reinforces its finality. Finality here does not mean inflexibility. It means a position is owned. Ownership changes how others respond. In personal relationships, the same pattern emerges. When explanations fall away, dynamics recalibrate. A person who once justified boundaries may now state them briefly or not at all. The boundary holds more consistently. Studies on interpersonal boundaries show that repeated verbal justification increases the likelihood of boundary testing. When justification is removed, the boundary becomes less negotiable, even without enforcement. Again, nothing aggressive is happening. The shift is structural. Carl Jung emphasized that individuation reduces the need for external validation. When validation no longer regulates inner stability, behavior simplifies. Simplification is often mistaken for withdrawal, but withdrawal avoids contact. Simplification clarifies it. You still engage. You still respond. You still care. What disappears is the excess. Excess explanation. Excess anticipation. Excess emotional management. This changes how responsibility feels. Earlier, responsibility carried psychological weight. It felt tied to identity, to worth, to outcome. Now, responsibility feels factual. Something needs attention. You address it, then it is done. There is less residue. This shift is supported by findings in occupational psychology. Individuals who exhibit low emotional reactivity and concise communication report lower cognitive fatigue. Even under high workload conditions, the reduction in fatigue is not due to fewer tasks, but fewer internal negotiations. Quiet authority conserves energy. Energy conservation allows continuity. You are no longer restarting internally every day. This continuity is often overlooked, but it is one of the clearest signs that a reorganization has completed. Carl Jung noted that psychological transformation does not announce itself through excitement, but through stability. Stability allows life to proceed without constant self-correction. You begin to notice that you trust your timing, not because you have certainty, but because urgency has faded. Urgency belonged to dispersion. When energy was scattered, everything felt time-sensitive. Decisions demanded immediate clarification. Silence felt dangerous. Now, time stretches differently. Pauses feel neutral. Waiting feels tolerable. This has practical effects. In conversations, you allow silence without rushing to fill it. Others often speak more. They reveal more. They clarify themselves. Communication research shows that silence increases disclosure from others when it is not paired with evaluative cues. The absence of explanation creates space. This space is not manipulative. It is structural. You are no longer managing the interaction. You are present within it. Presence without management is felt as authority, not imposed. Recognized. This recognition often surprises the individual. They may not feel powerful. They may feel ordinary. But ordinary is precisely the point. The psyche has stopped performing. Carl Jung believed that when the ego relinquishes its need to control outcomes, the self assumes regulation. This does not produce charisma. It produces coherence. Coherence is quiet. It does not demand attention. It receives it. Daily life begins to feel workable. Not exciting. Not inspired. Workable. You act when action is appropriate. You stop when it is not. There is less internal commentary. You are no longer narrating yourself to yourself. This internal silence is as important as external silence. Earlier, explanation occurred internally before it occurred outwardly. You justified to yourself before you justify to others. That internal loop has closed. Without internal justification, external explanation becomes unnecessary. This is why quiet authority feels stable. It is not maintained through effort. It is maintained through completion. The completion is not conscious. You cannot recall when it happened. You only notice that certain patterns no longer reappear. You do not over-explain. You do not anticipate reactions. You do not rehearse responses. Not because you forbid yourself, because the impulse is gone. This absence is the marker. Psychological patterns do not disappear through resistance. They dissolve when their function ends. Explanation had a function. That function has ended. Carl Jung wrote that when psychic energy withdraws from a form, the form collapses quietly. There is no conflict, only disuse. This is what has occurred. Silence remains, not as a discipline. As a default, you speak when something needs to be said. You stop when it is complete. This simplicity feels grounded. You are not trying to be quiet. You are simply not compelled to fill space. Others feel this. They respond differently. They approach differently. They adjust expectations. Not because you change your personality, because you change your center. The center moved inward. And when the center is stable, behavior organizes itself naturally. This is the lived outcome. Not power as dominance. Not silence as strategy. Quiet authority as a byproduct of psychological consolidation. Nothing more. Nothing less. Silence did not become powerful because it was chosen. It became powerful because explanation completed its role. What changed was not behavior. It was orientation. Psychic energy returned to its center. The need to manage perception dissolved. Presence became sufficient. Carl Jung understood this as a movement toward inner authority, where alignment replaces reinforcement. Nothing was added. Nothing was learned. Something reorganized. And when reorganization completes, silence remains without effort. If this reflection describes something you recognize in your own experience, you may want to stay connected to this channel. You're welcome to subscribe to the Inner Shadow Signal if these psychological shifts resonate with you. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments as well. Not explanations, just observations.